talk about truncus arteriosus. And for this one, like the name actually kind of makes a lot of sense, right? It's like a big old trunk right here, and instead of having one blood vessel to each, you just have like one big fat one that takes care of both the jobs of the pulmonary artery and the aorta, right? At least at the start. And then they just kind of split off here. So immediately off the bat, there's a lot of problems, right? There's mixing going on here, but also both ventricles are pushing into this same opening, right? So there's equal pressures being delivered to the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Obviously, usually the pressures in the pulmonary system are lower than those of the systemic system. That's the whole point of, that's the whole reason why if you have a ductus arteriosus, that you have blood going from the aorta into the pulmonary artery, right? Because in a normal person, the aortic pressure is very high and the pulmonary artery pressure is low, right? So that's normal. You get really low pressures here, you have really high pressures here. In this situation, these pressures are equal, right? They're both being pushed from the same source and going through the same opening right here. So in that sense, the pressures meet kind of in the middle. So the pressures in the aorta are lower than the body would want. The pressure in the pulmonary arteries are higher than the lungs would want. And that's going to drive a lot of the symptoms that we'll see in a sec. So we already saw that in the picture. That's fine. The VSD is usually present as seen in the picture as well. So let's see. So you can have cyanosis pretty quickly. So this is a condition of increased pulmonary blood flow, which makes sense, right? Because we're pushing blood both to the body and to the lungs with the same amount of pressure, right? And this is that amount of pressure is way too high for the lungs. It's way more than it's used to, so it's just going to get a lot of blood flow going to it. Poor feeding, poor growth, like I said, very non-specific. CHF, you just have to know that it develops within 2 weeks after birth. So this is another one of the situations where maybe waiting and seeing isn't really a great option. I already talked about how if you have cyanosis, then just expect clubbing, right? That's not really a huge stretch. And you can even expect all this kind of stuff. So once you saw the word cyanosis, all this should have already been completely obvious to you. It's like, hey, let's say that I have a child with a cyanotic heart defect. I'm not going to tell you what kind of heart defect it is. I'm just going to tell you that they sometimes get cyanotic, or maybe he was cyanotic at birth, whatever, right? There's one of the manifestations that we're seeing from this congenital heart disease is cyanosis. Would you expect tachypnea? Yes. Would you expect dyspnea? Yes. Would you expect retractions? Yes. Would you expect clubbing? Yes. In the same vein, if I told you, hey, I'm not going to tell you what the defect is, but it's a defect that increases pulmonary blood flow, right? Or maybe you saw truncus arteriosus in a test question, and you say, I can't remember anything about truncus arteriosus, except for one thing, that it has increased pulmonary blood flow. Okay, what do I know about increased pulmonary blood flow? Oh yeah, they have frequent respiratory infections. You're going to have increased pulse pressures, bounding peripheral pulses. Try to think about what I told you about the pulse pressures in my video on patent ductus arteriosus. And this is the same concept, just even way worse, right? Because it's just a much bigger connection between the artery, the pulmonary artery, and the aorta. We already talked about the fact that VSDs have the systolic murmur. So good. We talked about how chest x-rays and EKGs can show um, enlarging and this increased pulmonary markings, so that shouldn't be surprising to you. There is sometimes this right aortic arch that you can see with truncus arteriosus. That is a little bit unique. Same thing with echocardiogram as usual. We're gonna be able to see all these little things like if this maybe a semilunar valve, and we're gonna see that artery, of course. So the Rastelli procedures. I don't know if I have a picture of it. No, I don't. You can find pictures of it. It's pretty simple. It's exactly what you would expect, right? Because we need to separate these two circulations, but we need to make a new way for the ventricles to feed blood, right? Because right now we just have the one opening. So we just have to make a second opening that'll connect to one of those, and then we have to chop this connection off, right? So just trying to understand it conceptually like that, take a look at the picture, and it should be fairly obvious to you. So like I said, we want to make a new conduit, right? Because there's only, as of birth, the kid only has one conduit coming from the ventricles to anywhere. So we'll create this new path from the right ventricle to the pulmonary arteries and just cut off the connection between the aorta going to the pulmonary artery. Okay. Okay. So it makes sense when you look at it that repeated surgery will very well likely be necessary, because usually the pulmonary arteries is kind of like enlarging with time, right? As the kid gets bigger, his heart gets bigger, his veins get bigger. So in truncus arteriosus, you just have to try to match that with several surgeries as closely as possible. A few things about prognosis are listed down here. So this is one of those conditions where it's serious enough, and this strenuous activity is so dangerous to the child that we'll actually not let a child engage in competitive or strenuous sports if they have truncus arteriosus. So this is too dangerous for them.